one time we did something here, there wasn't somebody else having random music playing in the background. Just eerily quiet instead. Man, what's going on?
Oh, this would have been a perfect time for that trumpet, dude.
Yeah, it would have been a perfect time for that trumpet guy back there. It's raining. Not a good day for him. Did. All right, let's so today I'm gonna try and talk about this concept of higher order components. I think I've tried this before. I don't know how to change the color of this thing. I'm sure there's some way to do it, but try and make it a little more friendly to you because I know the dark is harder to see. Might be okay. Well, I'll do it this way because this will work and will still be bright enough or whatever. Yeah, actually, it might be too ugly. Close this. All right. I'm going to try and talk about higher order components and what they are and how they work. But I think before we dig too deep into that, it's useful to talk about step outside of React and discuss sort of the underlying concept behind what we're trying to do with a higher order component, because it's a programming technique or approach that you don't necessarily use a lot when you're just starting coding. It's a very functional model, and that's the idea of passing functions around, which we've actually been doing in React. We just don't realize that we're doing it very often, because every React component, whenever you like in the app, for example, you're invoking your paper or your stopwatch, like that's just invoking a function ultimately to render something there. But it's sort of hidden. But higher order components are built on this notion of passing functions around to compose some functionality in useful ways instead of having to create unique instances of stuff all the time. And let me try and give you a starting example of what I'm talking about in terms of composing functions. We'll build up a little bit from a starting point. So, you know, we've all in class or anything, we've written something like add, right? And you'll have like A and B as your arguments, and it just like returns A plus B. That's a pretty simple function. But it's also possible to not just necessarily have a function that like returns a direct primitive, like something like that. You can always return a function from a function. So, and I've shown this before a little bit, but I want to go over all of this again, sort of building up, and then we'll talk about also passing functions in as parameters as well as sort of the next step, building into this logical approach to composing programming language, right? So if we could do something that's maybe a little different now, and this is a very contrived example, not necessarily the most practical, but starting with the contrived example, we should be able to build up to some things that are a little more useful. So let's say that, you know, we want to, I don't know what we want to do, add, we just want to add 42 to anything for whatever random reason, right? Or a random number. Let's say we want it to vary, right? So I'm going to create a function here, and we'll call it create add my favorite number. So it's worded a little strange here, right? Like create add my favorite number, because normally a function might be called like add my favorite number, and I'm wording it that way intentionally, which we'll get to. So now let's just say there's a number in here. Let's make it very specific. We're passing in to this is your favorite number, right? But if this is like the add function that we had before, we're missing one piece of information to be able to add your favorite number, which is to add something, you need two numbers, right? So we only have half of the information we need, which means this wouldn't be a complete function like to add something. It can't do that because it just didn't take enough. So one thing we can do though is now that we've passed in favorite number, if we call this, we can return, and I'm going to use this arrow function syntax because it's just easier to write when you're returning something. We're going to return another function that takes number, and I'll just shorten it to num. And what it's going to return is favorite number plus num. So now what this actual function is returning is not, this function isn't returning the computed value, it's returning another function. So if I did, I can name it whatever I want. I wonder if numbers are valid. I think they are, so let add 42 equals I'm going to pass 42 into this. Then if we looked at the type of add 42, it's a function. And if we just did like add 42, it tells us it's a function here, right? And so what we could do is call it with any other number, and we get back out that number plus 42. So what we've created is we've got, yeah, this is a sort of interesting model of programming, but it is, in this case, it's sort of contrived, very basic, but it's also a very powerful tool to be used in a lot of different paradigms. So I can show you, trying to think off the top of my head, because that's what I was going to try and do, is pull up some really strong examples of some of this stuff, of when to use it. I know I can think of some examples of taking in a function. There are some really useful examples for doing something like this as well, where you return a function. And may not have what they are exactly off the top of my head, but a lot of times where it's really useful is when you're returning a function and something else doesn't need to know about that first part of the information, or maybe it doesn't ever get a chance to know about that. So this is, like, again, it's a little bit of a weird paradigm, but now we could also create a different function off of this, right? So it's a function, but we could create another one, which could be like add 7. I'll do it long form, and that could be seven. And what we get back is a function. Essentially what it's returning is this whole function, but this function hasn't been invoked. And what this is known as, by the way, the ability to have reference to this first number that you passed in this scope of your second function. If you haven't heard that term, that's called a closure. So in JavaScript, what it means is you've closed over this other variable. So nothing else has access to the number that you passed in, this favorite number. There's no other way to get access to what got passed in there. But this function that gets returned does have access to it. It still is closed over it. It's within the scope of what it needs to work on. So now we could always call, add 7 with any number. It doesn't matter, and we'll get back 7 added to that number. I know, again, like I say, this is a little contrived, but does at least the concept of being able to return a function make sense? And I can write this so that, something like this may be streamlined a little more when you write it out, because it would be pretty common. I use the arrow notation there. So one thing you'll encounter a lot in modern JavaScript code examples are just sort of multiple arrow notations together. So you'll see something that might look like this. I'm going to rewrite this like add favorite number. I'm not going to type the whole thing out again, so we'll just make it shorter. create add. I'm going to say this one takes your favorite number. I'm going to use the parentheses again to be clear about what it's doing. And it's a function using this arrow function notation that returns a function that takes a number that returns, let me use the parentheses again, function that takes a number that returns favorite number plus num. So that's the same thing that we just wrote as the original version, just a little more concise. But this is a function that takes another, or that returns another function that takes another argument that, and so you don't even have to necessarily have assigned this to something in between, right? Like you could do create add 5 and then call it again right afterwards 7 and get back a result, right? You're getting one function, you're getting a second one. So this is a pattern that you'll see used. This specific pattern of sort of a function that takes one and then just takes something, returns another function that returns something. Somebody's watching the video. Does this make sense for the most part? This pattern? All right, I'm trying to keep it out. Yes.
Good question. Something I've noticed is on like MDN JavaScript documentation, I find that a lot of their examples are like nesting together functions, I think in a similar way. It's really hard for me to follow.
Yes.
What they're doing.
Yes.
To me, it looks really complicated.
Right.
Yeah, so that's something where I feel like I've seen this kind of a lot.
I'm sure you have. Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of uses for it. And there's a lot of documentation out there. There's a lot of books on how to code this way. It's becoming much more popular to do. So this is sort of a paradigm of function. There's different paradigms of programming, and they don't all conflict with each other, but they lead to different approaches, right? And so in a lot of languages for a long time, Ruby, even JavaScript supports it. There's been this concept of object-oriented programming, where the things that you interact with, the things that work with each other are objects. And they'll pass messages between each other to say like, you know, add something to it. But objects are the fundamental thing that you're interacting with. And then functional programming, it doesn't conflict with object-oriented programming necessarily, but it's a different model where the idea is your primary building block is not necessarily these objects, but a lot of functions interacting with each other and passing stuff around in different ways. And JavaScript, luckily, is a very flexible language that supports all these different paradigms, but functional programming works very nicely in it. And one of the reasons is because in JavaScript, and this is a term we haven't talked a lot about, but functions are first-class objects or first-class constructs. And what that means is you can just pass functions around, right? So in this case, we're passing a function around by returning a function. But we can also pass a function around by, and let's do something else. So now I'm going to flip this and show sort of another direction of composing stuff with functions. And then there'll be some practical examples of it. In fact, this very first one will be sort of practical, right? Which is, we could create something like, let's create a function called, I'm going to call it create again. No, I'm just going to call it form computation, right? And so the first thing that it's going to take is the computation, if you will. And then the second thing it's going to take are, you could compose this a lot of different ways. I'll do it this way. And I'm being very verbose here, where I wouldn't really name them this wide normally. So now the idea of this function is to be able to sort of hide what the computation is a little bit. You'll get what I'm getting at in a minute. But let's say this thing is going to return computation, and we're assuming that that first argument was a function, so we're going to invoke that inside of here. And what we're going to pass, and I'm going to assume that it was like an array of arguments in this second thing. You could build this out a lot of different ways. I'm going to return that from this function when it returns. And so now this is where you get to something sort of interesting. We could create different computations to be performed, but sort of hide what the computation is in a sense, almost, right? Like we're passing it in, but we're doing it in a, it is a little abstract here. It'll hopefully make a little more sense in even the next example, but we could be like perform computation. And because I didn't write out something beforehand, well, here, let me create one. Function add. Oh, did I already have add in here? Let me see. Do I still have it? Oh no, I started again. All right. Function add. Return A plus B. So I've got a function, and I've got perform computation. So I could do perform computation, add, and then an array like 3, 4. And what it's going to do is then invoke that computation with those arguments, right? So that's me passing a function around as a first-class citizen. So now if we combine those two concepts a little bit here, let's say, oh, I don't want to immediately, I don't want to have to pass in an array, and I don't want to immediately invoke that computation. I want to be able to invoke it later. You know, like we did. So you could do like, I'm going to be lazy here again. Let me write this out with the syntax. It would be what you'd see a lot more, even though it's a little different. So this takes a computation, and what it's going to return is, oh, I like the parentheses just to be clear what's going on, be consistent there that way. And then it's going to take, can I do this way? I think it might work. It's going to be I'll stick with the array type model or whatever. So then it will do the computation on whatever these arguments are that were passed in and return the result of that. So now what we could do is we could create like multiply, which is going to equal create, yeah. Online. I do not know if there's something I can do. Let me see. Well, that's useful. I don't know what I can do to help with that. It might just be a bad, like, slow video signal from here. Right now, does it look like it's just a slow video signal, maybe? What? Low quality, probably. Yeah, so it's probably being recorded at high quality and streaming badly. So hopefully if people watch it later, it'll be higher quality if that's the case. So let's say this is I'm going to be creating a multiply type thing. And so what I'm going to do is the first argument to it is literally just a function that takes two arguments, A and B. and returns the result of multiplying them. And now, if we looked at mult, it's just a function. And I could invoke it, like 4 and 5. Mine is not a function. Of course, I did something wrong. Takes these args, spreads them into this. Oh, you know why? Because I have to send it as an array. That's right. I believe. And it returns our value, right? And I could do it without doing an array. If there's ways to change it to say, like, take an array of arguments, or take your arguments and apply them a certain way. I'm just keeping it a little simple here. So we could make it look more like a traditional function. But what we've done there is the same sort of thing. We've created a computation that takes this computation, and then it'll take the extra arguments for it, right? And at first that may seem a little silly. Okay, why didn't we just create multiply directly? But imagine a situation where, for example, one portion of your application knows what the operation is you want to perform, and somewhere else knows the data that's going into it. And so if that's the case, what you could do, it's like, okay, I've got these two different parts of my application that are being set up. At one point, somebody tells me what operation they want to perform, and somewhere else is the data that I'm pulling out to perform it. Yeah, I could, like, make these communicate directly, like do some complex thing where they're sharing this state, or where I've got a big table that says, oh, they chose this operation. But I could also potentially just say, oh, just here's the operation they want to perform, pass this. I don't want to have to remember the name of each one of these different functions and pass it through. So just pass a computation down, knowing that whatever operation it is that's being performed, they all now look the same to the thing that's invoking them. A real practical example, a real hands-on type example where you may do something like this is, imagine in your application, if you want to do logging. You want to log for, okay, well, when I'm developing the application, I don't actually want those logs to go to my server where I need them to go when it's running live. I don't need them to go to the database or wherever that is. I just want to log them to the console or something, right? But I don't want to have my code have a whole bunch of if statements in it. All throughout my entire application, I could write things that are like, if debug, then, console.log, else go somewhere else. What you may have in that same vein is, early in your program, you may have different places. You're like, oh, I'm just going to encapsulate that logic in one place in my code to check for this debug. But what I'm going to do is return a logging function that I can just invoke directly. So imagine a create logger. And what this will take is whatever your logging function is, and then, oh yeah, let me write it out the same way I was doing these other ones. So this takes a logging function, and then that takes a message. And what that's going to do is just log the message, right? And so now, in one place in our code, we could have an if statement instead of all over the place that says, ooh, if I'm in debug mode, like where I'm creating this logger originally or whatever, I could have a little logic that says, ooh, if this is in debug, this is my development environment, this is something else, then logger equals create logger console.log. So all I did was pass it a function. It's just a function that already exists. And now when I call logger, like hello world, it logs it to the console. But if instead, like it was, oh no, this is the production environment, then maybe we log somewhere else instead of to the console, right? So we can change it in that one place. It could have been logger equals create logger, and I don't have a server, so I'm going to log it to the worst possible place you can log it. an alert message. Oh, because I'm in node, alert doesn't exist. But I can't do it to an alert in here. So that won't exactly work, but we could do it something like this. This will work, although it's going to be, a little contrived, but create logger console.err. So instead of it going to the console.log, it'll go to console.err or whatever. And then we could say logger hello world. And what it really did, it looks the same, but it actually is logging an error message as that instead of like the log, right? Now in reality, you may say, oh, actually that goes to my server when it logs there. But in my development environment, it goes to my console so that I can see these messages right there and I know what's going on. Does that make sense as a real world type of example where this type of logic would exist? All right. So this is, I'm going over this outside of React because this is really the exact same pattern of a higher order component. The entire concept of a higher order component is it's a function that takes a component as an argument and returns another component. But if you remember, there are two different types of components that exist, right? We've got class components and we have function components, right? So at the most basic level, let's say we're building out something in React. We can build higher order components that look almost exactly like what we just wrote here, because it can literally be a function that just takes a functional component and returns another functional component. And the question is, what's the value of this? Why does this exist, right? There's nothing, again, this is why I said this isn't part of like React as a language. This isn't part of the ecosystem of React that these exist. This is just a way that they found to compose stuff. But there's a lot of things that you can get very nicely with higher order components that are benefits. And logging is a great example of it. So you may say, you don't want to have to necessarily write this logging code again into a bunch of different components if you're going to add some logging. You sort of want it to be something that's generic, that's all captured in one place instead of having to define that same logic over and over and over. And so one way you can do that is by writing, say, a higher order that you pass your component into and it'll return another one. Let me dig down in here. There are some other good examples, like in the React documentation, they've got one that talks about like a comment list here and the benefits that you can have from using it. Where what you can do is maybe add a data subscription to a component. So if you remember before, a good example of this type of thing is another case where you might want this is you want your components to be very clean, very simple if possible, right? Makes them easier to understand, easier to work with. So let's go look at this clock that we worked with last class. And the last thing that we added to this was all of this logic around APIs, right? Go fetch the time from the API, render my clock, manage this sort of getting my initial time logic. But what that's done now is it's made this clock component a lot more complicated. We had to add a whole bunch of logic into this guy to manage this. Well, now we have all this component did mount logic. What do I have to do when I've mounted? We have to keep track of it in here. So there's a whole bunch of state management that we had to necessarily add into this component to deal with this API logic that we had before. Yeah, we had state of the time before, but it may not have been as complicated. Now let's say instead, I'm gonna go with something like this, but we'll simplify it a little bit where we're not updating our state continually, because the clock is complex because you have to keep refreshing, right? So let me create one. I'm going to just go ahead and copy this. We're going to make it almost the same thing, but we're going to simplify it and just make it a date. So we'll just make a date.js. Let me start simplifying this guy. We don't want to deal with all of this clock logic. The only thing we really want to do is going to be a lot like the clock, except I don't care about the time at all. I don't care about this. I'm going to say, well, let me bring one back in and I'll say today's date is, and I want to show some sort of formatted date. But it has, I don't have to deal with logic around a tick in this because it's not going to be updating. Clearing my interval doesn't matter. I do fetch some stuff still, but I'm not setting an interval because this guy's not going to have that level of complexity, right? But we still have, let me see if there's anything else I need to change here. This is pretty close. All right, I'm going to try and add this to my app. Let's. What?
Your export down at the bottom.
It's called clock. It's actually, you know, I don't have to change it because it's my default export. So I could call it, this isn't a good approach, but you can call it whatever you want in here and then call it whatever you want outside if it's your default. If it's a named export, you can't. So I could keep calling it date in here and then, or clock, and then export it as date, or call it date in another file. Only if it's the default, you can do it. You can do that with named ones. It's just a little harder. You have to say like, import this as like something named this as something else. With the default, it doesn't matter. Just call it whatever you want when you import it. But yeah, we can change the name. So now I've got a date component, right? And I can't remember where we hooked this up at. Okay, we hooked it up here. So let's pull this guy in, just like we have anything else. We're gonna bring this in and just do the date and add, copy this whole thing. Yeah, it's a little convoluted, but that's part of the point here. And we're making a date object. Actually, I think my server might even still be running. Let's see. Oh, see, it's still trying to bind something that doesn't exist. Let's see, something went wrong. I don't know what went wrong. I might not have to. I don't know what went wrong. Oh, I've got a complaint that I didn't tell it. I'm from somewhere else, so it's got an issue. I think this is because I'm requesting a resource from a different page that's not my own site. Crash this, see if it'll work, but I actually expected this to have a problem last time. I'm surprised we didn't, and now I'm really surprised that it's suddenly showing up now. Maybe they updated their server. Very strange. I expected that to happen last time. Oh, no. This is because of my network connection. I just killed anyone who's, what? Yeah, I don't know why it worked before and not, but it's got a problem because it's going through this pass through. That's part of AU main. So that's what's causing the problem, it looks like. I don't know if I'm going to be able to fix that very easily without doing something like going offline, which I don't want to do. Let me see if I can cause me to fix that. Yes. Maybe this will fix my being blurry problem too. There we go. That's fine. I don't. Date.render. This.state.date time. A string is not a function. Let me see. That should be easy enough to troubleshoot. Convert to JSON, set time. Set my loading to false then. So weird. I don't know why it yells. Let me try one more time. No. This.state.date time.to local string. To locale date string. That should totally be legit. Well, let's see what I got back here. It's going to show me. Let's try it again. No, I don't care about these breakpoints right now. No, I'm sure I should. Unhandled rejection, type error. All right. Where is my request? Looks legit. Current date time, current date time. Setting it here. Loading should be true. I set loading to false, and I've got an error over here. I don't know. So weird. Let me get rid of this real fast. Still gonna blow up. That works. So I must have done something wrong when I forked this date file. There's got to be something else wrong in here still. Or to JSON, then it calls set time. Should be right up there. All right, so let's debug this guy a little bit. What? Yeah, there's a keyboard shortcut, Control P, which will pull up if you have the DevTools open, and then you can type your file name and find your file pretty easily. So all right, let's see. It's calling set time. So now my date time should be something legit. Then it yells at me that it's not. That must be when it renders here. So let me set a breakpoint in my render. Hey, you guys are learning how to debug code. All right, it renders. Now I'm setting my time. Now loading should be false. Error should be undefined. Date time. That doesn't look right. Date time is still null. Loading is true. What just happened? Tells me it's false there. Oh, now it's rendering again. Loading false. Thinks that loading is true. How's it getting there if it thinks that loading is true? I am very lost as to what's failing here. I'm going to try one more thing. I'm going to try to restart my server again. Perils of doing something live. Nope, still blowing up. I have no clue. All right, we're loading, so I won't hit my second breakpoint. Now I've set this, so loading should be false. And this is the weird part. Why don't I see my actual value there? Wow. All right, no clue what's wrong here. I'm going to get rid of my air handler. I don't think I'm ever hitting that, but let's just say I don't want to handle it if that hits that. Yeah, this is throwing me for a complete loop. I don't know why this one is doing this. That value can't have changed between this point in time and this point in time. To lookout date string, date. We don't have a problem in the clock. Nope. It's killing me. Set time, set error, it sets it, sets it. Very, very puzzled. Well, let's see if we can work around that anyways. Is not a function. So I'm going to cheat. The time, because I can't figure out what's wrong here. It should work. All right, maybe I have something wrong here. This has to be right. So let me see. New date. Just verify this. So I've got to have another error somewhere in this that's causing that failure. It looks like that's where the failure is, but it's not. It's like messing with me. Here's my constructor, here's my component. If anybody can figure this out, I'm all ears. Because I thought this would bypass it. Now I'm very puzzled. Let me try it this way. All right. Date.toLocale date string is not a function. I know that's just not true. Let's try toString. Let's see what happens. All right. What about just toDate string? Let's see if that works. I'll bet you it won't. It thinks it's not a date object. How is it blowing up and thinks it isn't a date object from here to here? I have no clue. I'm gonna get rid of all the error handling stuff, minifying the code, trying to get rid of anything that could be causing a problem here. This isn't a bad example of actually trying to debug something that could be going wrong. I'm pretty confident that this should work. So I'm trying to strip down what's going on in here to get rid of possible issues. All right, still having an issue. I'm going to simplify this guy even more. I'm going to say at the very beginning, loading is false. I'm putting this date time a new date right then. I'm just going to comment out my component did mount, so nothing else should get called. Whoa, that thing got rendered a lot of times. Range error, maximum call stack exceeded. All right, well, this won't exist. Oh no, this should be fine. Wait, it shouldn't matter much. All right, what's wrong in here still? I know what's wrong. I think. It's a very subtle bug, I believe. Yeah. So if nobody caught that, that was a very, very subtle bug. I had named my class date, but date is already an object in the DOM or in JavaScript. And so when I was calling new date in here, instead of what I did was I had replaced the existing date object with my class now. And so I was recursively calling my own object again and again and again and again and again, and recreating new instances of my own thing, which would then it was when this created, create another one, and calling it to create another one, and calling it to create another one, and so on and so on and so on. So yeah, that's a good example of troubleshooting something. That was a very subtle issue. That I wouldn't have been surprised. Usually something like that could take a lot longer than that to try and troubleshoot. So now I think I can bring everything back. All right, I should be able to get this working again. And I'm gonna go back in here, and this, I'm not gonna call this date. Date time, I can call the file date still, but I'll just say date time. This guy, I got everything back. I think I do everything that matters. Oh, set this to null initially. We don't have something. Let's see here. Cannot render to locale date string of null. That's fine. That's fine. Set time. Set time. That's still a much better error. Oh, I have loading set to false initially. I need to flip it. There we go. All right, we've got it back. Yay. Whew. That was a lot of setup. That was a lot of crazy. But what we've got is a date object, a date component. But it's sort of doing two things, right? It's both rendering and it's also fetching the data. So there's a lot of different ways to handle this, but one possible way to separate this thing out would be doing some sort of higher order component type model. So one potential way to resolve something like this would be saying, okay, what I want to do is pull out all of this component did mount logic, and I only want to actually return this date object or this date component, date time one, if I've already got the data. Otherwise, I don't want to do that, right? And that would greatly simplify this. So what I'm going to do here to sort of accomplish that is, and you would do this differently depending on what sort of higher order component project you're doing. Is the first thing I'm going to do is I'm sort of just going to copy this guy. This is me being a little on the, I get this to the right level. Let me see, where is this match? Okay. Should be correct. So this is me saying, all right, I know I'm going to want a simplified version of this, right? So, and you could call this a lot of different things. I'm going to say this is just a view to imply this isn't intended to do a lot of logic. It's just a visible version of something. And then what I'm going to do is start pulling the stuff out that I don't really want in this. So probably, if I don't need to make the call in here, I don't need any sort of constructor logic. I don't need set time. I don't need component did mount, because this isn't going to do any of that fetching of something. So then, all right, render, yeah, we can leave this here, but this component has now gotten much simpler because it's not going to manage that state. So instead, let's just assume that we send something in. So we've changed, I'm going to change this over and say, oh, these are props that get sent in. Date time gets sent in, loading gets sent in. And now we're actually so simple that we could even turn this into a functional component because there's no state, there's nothing else that we need. So we could make it even a step simpler by making it a functional component if we wanted. But now what we're missing is, how is this guy going to get, how are we going to make that query for this state, right? So what we could do is we could create a function, get date time, like components, or create, if you will, and what this function is going to take in is another component. And you could call this a lot of different things. Some people may just call it like comp. Some people would say like wrapped component. I'm going to use that just so it has a lot of clarity going forward. And what we actually want to do from this is return another component. So we're going to take a component in and return a component, but that component may or may not render our wrapped component. It depends, right? Usually you're injecting something into your wrapped component, and that's sort of what we'll do here. But so now I'm going to take all this that existed before, our date time object. I'm going to put it up into this function for the time being. I'm going to export the, I'll leave this as date time down there, and we'll clean that up in a minute. And now I can say, what bits of logic does this component care about? If this is the thing that fetches the data and is going to render something else, and let's say what it renders is this wrapped component passing something in. So this cares about, well, it's going to need state. So it needs the constructor logic in the state. It's going to need to be able to set the time value locally. It's going to need to be able to do some logic around mounting. But most of this render logic, or all of it in the way that we have it built out right now, it really doesn't need any of that, right? We could pull all of this render logic out because all it needs to render now, thanks to the changes that we've made, is our wrapped component. And it sets some values on that wrapped component. So it sets loading is equal to this dot state dot loading, and date time is equal to this dot state dot date time. Now what we would do here is instead of like exporting default date time, because what we've got is a higher order component, so we need to invoke it to create something. Instead, we could export create get date time component, passing in our date time view. Oops. and what this is going to return, this is a function that took our component and returned another component that we can now use. Now this gets into that. I don't have to change the name that I'm importing with if it's the default. So the other bits of code here, my render method should have return statement. Oh, you know what? I'm not returning this. There we go. That should capture it, I think. Probably have some other bugs. All right, let's see what my next bug is. Oh, you know what? I'm not returning anything here. So what I need to return is date time out of this function because it wasn't giving it back anything, right? There was no return value, so it was getting undefined. I think that was my kicker there. There we go. And now we've got our date time rendering again. But by using this higher order component approach, we pulled out all of this logic of fetching the data into something separate. And so we were able to, now we've got this guy here, which is nice and clean, right? Like a component that's simple, it's not that convoluted. If we just wanted to test how does our UI look, if we want to change how our UI looks, we don't have to worry about touching that networking code or the logic around it. We're not like, oh man, maybe I messed up the networking code. It's just this one bit and we're composing bit by bit. Now you could also have done this by wrapping with a component that the date logic. But if you did that, you wouldn't be able to, like maybe you've got different types of components, different ways to display the date time, right? Like if our clock wasn't then ticking up the time after it's gotten it, if it was just static, like we got the time once, then we could use this create get date time component and say, oh, I want to wrap our clock too to just show the time once. And that would work just fine as long as it accepted these same parameters. And that would let us reuse this function to compose other components in this sort of built up style. So let's do a example of that. Let's break out one more thing out of this into another reusable component. So let's create one, create loading component. Now what this is going to take is a wrapped component. We'll just call it the same way. This one can be really, really simple. This can just let loading component. So we're going to do a functional version here. Take some props. Oh yeah, that is one thing I sort of missed here. You'll see that it'll make, this one will make a little more sense about the props bit. So we're creating a new functional component. It takes some properties. And what it's going to do is if props.loading, so we're just encapsulating this loading logic, return loading. Else, return wrapped components. And what we want to do is pass all of the props that were originally passed into this into our wrapped component. So that's what this syntax does, is it says this props object that got passed into me, just pass those down into this wrapped component directly, whatever they are. I don't care what they are. And now from this, I need to return my loading component. And now what I could do is, like inside of here, instead of having to have, or inside of here, for example, instead of having to have the loading logic, we could say, oh man, this thing, it really doesn't need to care about loading logic. I want it to be clean, so it's just, you know, easy to work with. And I want this loading logic to be reusable across multiple places. So now, and this gets a little convoluted, we're going to compose this thing up a couple times. We're going to, and I'll break it out, and then I'll show you how a lot of other things would have it written, right? Loading date time component. So I'm going to create this variable. And what we'll do is we'll invoke this create loading component and pass in our date time view. So now it's got loading functionality wrapped around it as this higher order component. But now what we need to do here is instead of passing in our date time view, we need to pass in our loading date time component. We're sort of wrapping this up and adding functionality layer by layer through these component stacks. So then now it's got the loading functionality, but we stripped it out entirely from this guy, and this original one doesn't even have to worry about whether or not he's loading. And let's say I want to reuse this create loading component in other places, because why wouldn't I? So this is something I can reuse over here in, well, I guess I can't because this has to manage its own state. So the state's internal, and so it wouldn't have access to it. But if loading was being passed in as a property, you could just wrap something with this create loading component to inject that logic into multiple things. And then you're like, oh man, we really want to change what our loading icon looks like. We want to use a different thing. Like we really like the rotating circle, or we really like, you know, the 3 dots that flash. You can change it in this one place, and all of your things being wrapped in that loading component will just get it automatically. Plus, when you're looking at, oh, how do I work with this date time view? You don't have to think about the loading component logic. You pulled it out into something separate, and this guy gets to be very single-minded, very focused. And your loading higher order component gets to be very single-minded, very focused, do one thing. Is that making sense? Like where some of this value comes from, building stuff out like this? It is a very, it's a challenging concept when you first encounter it, right? This idea of I'm taking a component and then I'm going to return a component, and it's going to render the other component inside of it. It's challenging. I did it first with just pure functions. It's the same thing as functions that in code that will take a function and return something else that works with it. So don't be, if you are like trying to learn more on this, trying to dig into it, feel free to go look up documentation on how that works, like functional programming concept, because that will, there's probably a lot more on it, and it's going to hopefully be a little less intimidating than the higher order component logic, even though they're really the same thing. And then these can get as complicated as you want, because this is just a function. So we could, like, let's say, I don't know why, but let's say you want to be able to change your loading message, but you still want to use the same logic. So you could, you don't have to take just one argument. Like you could say loading message, and in this case, I'm just going to give it a default value of loading. You could say this higher order component, when it gets invoked, takes 2 arguments. It takes like my component and another thing. It can be whatever you want it to be. And then here, if it's loading, let's say, oh, I just want to return loading message. Or maybe it's not message. Maybe what we call this is loading components, because we pass in another component here. And we say, oh, I want this to be something like an actual component of some kind. So now let me make it just slightly more complex. Like, I don't know if this is going to let me do it this inline up here or not. Oh, looks like it did. So now I've just, this is a little weird writing it like that, but I just wrote a, all that was me giving it a default value, some JSX right up there. And now we could say loading component. what we need to do here, so we could do create loading component, and it should work. You know, our network's going to be fast, so you won't see it for very long. But if we chose to change that, and we're like, oh no, in this case, I want to send something different in. I want to send a div that says, I don't know. We're just giving it something a little more complex here that we're passing in instead. And let me see if I can throttle my network so we might be able to see it actually. So if we throttle this a little bit, I think fast 3G was enough last time, maybe. Then you can see that, right? So there's no requirement. There's no requirement that it takes just the component when you're building a higher order component. You can pass any parameters you want to pass into it to do other stuff. But the most basic version of it is it's a function that takes a component and will return another component, usually wrapping around your component that you originally had. And other examples of this might be, you know, I could do, there's some trivial ones, right? Sort of like the add. Maybe you create a higher order component for injecting color or something, and so it can add different colors. Make red, and all it might do is literally like pass the props in, and maybe it's like it also adds a color equals red property here to it. Because it can add whatever, since it's invoking that component then, it can add whatever it wants to into it. It doesn't have to just pass the stuff straight through. So you could compute something and pass it down into it. There's a lot of different uses for these, but they're a very, very common paradigm when you're working with React for building out some stuff. So if we go and look at theirs, right, their example in the documentation is comment list with subscription. So they did the same sort of thing. They're pulling out the subscription thing to say, oh, here's my data source and I'm subscribed to it, so that when that data gets updated, or when that data happens, it gets rendered. And with subscription is their higher order component that they made, which then takes whatever component you want to render and whatever the subscription logic is. How am I going to go get my data? They've got a great example here too. And they've got a lot more information in their documentation about what you want to deal with when you're dealing with higher order components, the trade-offs, because there are some disadvantages to higher order components. And then they talk about the best ways to maximize your composability with them. How can you actually make this stuff work very effectively? How can you work with this concept in a way that makes sense? And then, yeah, another one that's really useful is if we went and looked over here in our dev tools at our rendering, this is not going to be as useful as it would have been before. So before, if I was looking, I can't remember, do I have the React dev tools? I think I had a problem last time not having them on this system, or they didn't show up. Let me see. There they are. So if we look at our React dev tools, and we're trying to look at this, it's gotten a little nicer because it just rendered the date time view here. But you can see this loading component bit, which does have some sort of name. So it's still a little nicer than it would have been some other times I've done this. But it can be hard sometimes to understand what your higher order component is. Like this loading component, it's not really what I care about. So you can do some things to make this a little nicer when you're inspecting your components and working with them. Things that are like, you can change the display name here. So like, I'm going to try and steal their logic, their get display name. It should have a display name anyways. So I think that'll be fine. But yeah, you might make it look a little more, or give it a little more information. So you'd say like this loading component, like their display name. And you guys haven't worked inside of these tools as much, but this is a sort of a common pattern where you might be like, the wrapped component dot display name. I want the name of this guy to look like it's wrapping something. Let's see if this works. I think it will, but I'm not 100% sure. Oh, it must not have had a display name. It may have had a name or something though. Let me see. Yeah, it must not have had an actual display name for my wrapped component in here. I wonder if it has a name. Let's try this. Come on. You can find it. There we go. So now our like higher order component has this name of loading component wrapped around a date time view. And that's sort of a useful thing to get out of it. It looks like the React Dev Tools though. So I think they've gotten a lot smarter. In the past, they wouldn't have shown this guy here separately. That's just not the way that they would have rendered. So I think they're getting better at being able to compose this stuff and show you what's going on your React Dev Tools, which is really nice. But that's definitely something that has evolved and gotten improved since the past. But patterns like that can be useful because then it sort of tells you like what this guy is. Like, what am I wrapping around? Oh, this is a higher order component wrapped around something else. And this is what he's wrapped around. Any questions on this conceptually? Like, there are a lot of uses for it. Yeah, it's a big topic. The reason I said it's not part of the core is because, again, this isn't functionally part of React, right? This just comes about as a result of the way React components can be composed. And that's why I also talked about the function composition type stuff before outside of React, because that's really the concept. This is just applying it into React components. A lot. There's tons of on how to use them. There are some limitations, things that are challenges, but there's a lot of good resources on how to build stuff out with them and where it's useful. You'll find that I would say patterns where you see it a lot of things like loading, these sort of conditional things where you want to do one thing or another. Another time you might see it quite frequently is when you have one of several maybe components that you want to conditionally render. You're like, maybe I want to render this, or maybe I want to render this, or maybe this guy. Then the higher order component might be able to handle that logic for you and pull it out. And that way you don't have one component that has to have all of this in it. You can have like maybe 2 or 3 simple ones and then pull that conditional branching logic out. You use it a lot for data access, like the example here, where it's like with subscription, when I've gone and fetched my data, then bring it back. And you use it a lot to inject functionality like logging, or how to handle like error messages, or a lot of sort of cross-cutting, what you might call cross-cutting behavior. Like this cuts across the whole application, and so we want all these different components to share some of this logic or to reuse it. Those are the types of places where you'll encounter a lot of higher order component usage as well, because that higher order component can encapsulate that cross-cutting concern and hopefully just pass it into these different components very easily. And then you can get into much more complex or esoteric cases where it's really useful. Like we had one, give you a real example that we worked on just the last couple of days, is we're getting some data from a third party that has markup in it. So it's got HTML already in it, and we don't want that HTML. We want to get the text of what they sent us without the markup, right? And some people were like, oh, that's simple enough. We'll just, use some sort of regular expression to parse out the HTML. Did I book? I don't think I did. I've got to see if I'm logged into Stack Overflow. Because you don't want to do that. It's the short, but it's hilarious. Like the post somebody has about like, don't do that. Absolutely hilarious. But instead, what we did is we wrote a higher order component. And what that does is it takes in the text and it renders it into a component, into the DOM. And then it uses the inner text attribute of that DOM element to pull the text out without all the markup. So it lets the browser itself strip the markup and give you back the stuff without it. And then it renders the actual component with just that text passed into it. And that way we didn't have to, that way it doesn't matter what component we're passing the text into. We're not like directly bound to it. It can be any component that we want to pass the text into because anything can get passed into the higher order component. That's a real world, very complex example of us doing that just this week. So. No questions? Everyone's just completely like baffled at this. So there's something else really cool. Like I'm not going to write one right now, but in the same vein as that, functions that take functions and can return them. There's also a type of this. This is just fun now, at least to me. But this is in sort of this functional programming model. What is it called? I need to look up what it's called real fast. So there's a concept of a function. It's known as currying. That's right. So there's a concept known as currying. And this is in that same vein. And we could write the function to do this. It's actually really small to do this, but it's very, very dense, very complex code. I've never written it correctly without spending like, but the idea is, let's say you have a function, I don't know, it can take 4 different parameters. And so you're used to having to pass all those parameters to it at once, but it is possible to change the way that you write that so that you could pass it any number of parameters, 1, 2, 3, or 4, and only if it gets 1, 2, or 3, it'll return a function instead of returning the result that will take the remaining parameters or any number of them. So let's say it takes 4 parameters. You could call it with just the first one. It would give you back a function that needs 3. You could call that with like 1, which would give you back a function that needs 2, which you could call with just one of the parameters, gives you back a function that needs 1, and then you could call it with the last one, and it's like, oh, I've got everything I need. Here's your result. Or the first time you call it with 3 of them, and then it gives you back a function that only needs 1, and then when you call it with 1 more, it'll compute your result. So that's known as a curried function. And that's getting into some of the really crazy stuff that you can do when you're getting into this functional programming world. I mentioned that just to blow people's minds. If you thought what we were talking about today was hard. But that's really cool stuff. All right. I think that's all. Thanks you again for